So in the recent Borderlands 4 showcase, we got a ton of direct information, but we also got some information teased to us and just talked about a little bit to try to give us a bit of a glimpse into what could be coming, more specifically in the endgame portions of the game. So that's some of the stuff I wanted to talk about in this video, and more specifically about bosses and the seeming return of raid bosses on launch. So if you go to the end of the showcase, they made a cut where they were going into a boss room in the main campaign, but then they cut that and said they would talk more about endgame at some other time, and they instead went to some footage of the Vault Hunters jumping into a massive room. It almost seemed to kind of be in this void where this massive boss spawned. It kind of seemed like this almost crab type thing with what seemed to be some humanoid hooked up to it in the front, and then that crab type boss thing spawned just a ridiculous amount of arms that would start shooting a bunch of projectiles at the players and move around and do other abilities. And they were spawning these towers of hands that would fall over and the players would have to dodge it. They spawned this big ball in the middle where you had to jump to not get damaged by it. And every part of this fight made me think this was a raid boss. How they get launched into this room and there's this kind of protective barrier in front of it, almost seeming like they had to activate something or maybe pay a price to get into the boss arena. Just how big this boss is, a lot of the boss mechanics, a lot of it just seemed like this was a raid boss, or at least a raid style boss in terms of its mechanics, the size of it, and just how crazy of a fight it was. And another reason I think this may be a raid boss is they even turned off the HUD of this, so you couldn't see anything. You couldn't see the player HUD, you couldn't see the boss name or the boss health bar, you couldn't see legitimately anything. They turned all of it off, so that makes me think they want to hide it in some way. Now, it could be because this is a raid boss and they just want to kind of show off that there are these massive bosses going to be in the game at launch, or it could be some spoiler. This could possibly be a more end campaign boss and it would be a spoiler. Maybe this is one of the main NPCs kind of warped into this enemy. I actually did see a theory that this was Amara because of all of the different arms around it and how Amara spawns those arms out of her, that maybe this was Amara and this is how she dies and gets turned into this boss. Not exactly sure about that because some of the other elements of it didn't really make sense that much, but whether this is a raid boss or just like an end of campaign really big boss, it seems that bosses themselves are going to be a kind of larger part of Borderlands 4, even though they've always been a large part, but it seems like they're trying to make bosses just bigger, have a lot more interesting abilities. It seems like how they were talking about it, they kind of want it to be a bit more of the focus of some of the game, which definitely makes sense. Bosses have always been kind of a big focus for players, or kind of the main focus for players of most of the Borderlands games. There's always been a lot of them, but I do think there's room going into Borderlands 4 for there to be a bigger focus on bosses, bigger focus on more interesting mechanics, and a bigger focus on fighting and farming those bosses a lot more, especially with the new system of being able to just flip a switch in front of a boss room and be able to respawn that boss super quickly, no having to go back to the main menu and load back in to respawn bosses. And we do actually know a few additional things about bosses. First off, you have kind of your mini bosses that are still named enemies. Like in this gameplay showcase, they went up against what seemed to be a mini boss called Tim. And it seems that at least the mini bosses will be able to have the new modifier system, which is essentially taking the modifiers from ARPGs like Diablo, instead of having the mayhem modifiers that we had in something like Borderlands 3. So going much more with an ARPG modifier system, so they can have this modifier that gives them some randomized ability or effect. And it seems mini bosses can have that. We don't know if bosses will be able to have that. Like, we know there's going to be different difficulties, at least for the campaign. Maybe once you get to higher difficulties, actual bosses will also be able to have those modifiers on them. So that could put a pretty big wrench into boss fights and give just a lot more replayability on a boss. Because if you're farming the same boss over and over, that boss having a random modifier on it every time you fight it would definitely make the fights much more interesting. And that's definitely a thing that can start to kind of drain on players, is fighting the same boss over and over because you want their drop, but it's the exact same thing every time. So adding in even a little bit of randomness can just make that farming experience much more interesting and exciting. And then we did get to see some other pretty massive bosses. There was this massive like dinosaur creature that had, I think, massive cannons or massive miniguns on its back. And it did look like it had another big kind of container on its back. So maybe that was a massive boss with a massive loot container on its back. And we did get to see some other bosses that looked quite big besides the massive boss at the end that I think is a raid boss. And on top of all of that, we do know there are going to be world bosses because they specifically mentioned this when talking about how they're doing the new kind of seamless open world, not fully open world, but the game seems to be made up of 4 different zones that'll probably have a load screen between them. But when you get in one of those 4 zones, there's no load screens going anywhere there. So if you think about it, splitting up any Borderlands game into 4 different chunks, those different chunks would be absolutely massive. Borderlands 4 is going to be much bigger. So there's going to be massive seamless areas, and they're going to have random events, weather events. They're going to have random patrols of enemies. So it seems like there's also going to be these really massive world bosses. And we don't know if this means that these are going to be kind of considered a raid boss in the open world, or if they're just calling these world bosses because maybe they're like random spawn bosses that are just in the world and not tied to anything specific. So that's also something that's quite interesting. Maybe there's some amount of randomness with those world bosses. That's also another reason why I do think that big dinosaur that they showed may have a big loot container on its back, because if they're doing these kind of world bosses, maybe somewhat random, maybe you can't reset them, we don't exactly know. But if they're doing that, you wouldn't really want that boss to be kind of specifically for farming something, with how you'd have dedicated drops to something like Borderlands 3, where everything would have certain drops that they drop more of. You wouldn't want that if they were doing a boss that you couldn't respawn or farm as much as you wanted. But if you had these world bosses and just put like massive loot chests on them or something, that gives them a bit more randomness in their loot, but it allows these bosses to kind of be a big loot explosion and give you a bit of something different. So I am very excited to see how the bosses turn out for Borderlands 4. Pretty much everything they're doing with them sounds really good to me. The only thing we really need to know is how dedicated drops are going to work. Hopefully they're in Borderlands 4. I think they would have learned specifically from Borderlands 3 that we need dedicated drops at launch, especially with how randomized the loot can be with the manufacturer parts system. I'm very much hoping we have dedicated drops, but we still need to know how that system's going to work with all of these bosses. But I like how it seems there's the possibility of raid bosses being in on launch. I like how they're seeming to have a bigger focus on bosses, with also having more interesting mechanics and just having the bosses be more interesting and fun to fight, and then also adding in these new open world bosses. It seems they're doing a lot of things I'm really liking the sound of. But that's pretty much all I want to go over, so thanks for watching.
For now, let's jump ahead and show you something truly badass. In Borderlands 4, our bosses are bigger and better than ever, putting all your new skills, gear, and abilities to the ultimate test.
Whoa, 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 whoa. Spoilers. That's enough of that for now.